So will someone please tell me what's going on with Jesus? I mean, last week's gospel reading, he called a woman a dog. All she did was come in and ask him to perform a miracle, to heal her daughter. And he said, I don't feed the dogs. My interpretation. Now, according to Luke, this particular story would have followed an encounter that he had with his mother and his brothers. Some of you may remember it. They come. They want to see Jesus. But the crowd is so large that they can't get to him. Now, Luke doesn't have people hanging out of windows and lowering the paraplegic. They just have a large crowd. And so Mary does what seems to be reasonable. She gets someone who can get through the crowd. And she says, would you please go tell my son that I would like to see him? Seems like a reasonable enough request, doesn't it? But how does Jesus respond? You go tell her that my mother and my brothers are those who listen to God's word and do it. Well, kind of a slap in the face, isn't it? What is he trying to tell her? Yeah, she's only the woman who agreed to God's chaotic plan, the plan that set her life in a tailspin. You go tell her my mother is the one who does God's word? And then in today's lesson, a man comes. He wants Jesus to intervene on his behalf. It seems as though his brother, we're not told it's a man, but since only men could inherit property then, we will assume it was an older son, who refused to divide the family inheritance with one of the younger brothers. And so the brother says, sir, will you talk some sense into my brother? And Jesus calls him a fool. Okay, well, actually, Jesus calls the man in the parable a fool, but the man in the parable is aimed directly at the man who just asked to have the inheritance split with him. So, what's going on? I mean, where is the kind, generous, and understanding Jesus we've all grown to love and to adore? Something's obviously going on, and Jesus could be in a bad mood. You're right. The only way we're going to understand this is if we put it into context. We have to read what goes before it and what follows it, isn't it? And if we take time to do that, then we can discover some pretty amazing things. Well, remember the crowd that was blocking Mary and the brothers from seeing Jesus? From your experience, do you think everyone in that crowd was there for good reasons? You know, to hear what Jesus had to say, to be healed, or to bring a friend to him? Now, chances are that crowd was filled with some people that were self-seekers, right? They wanted to be there to see what they could get out of him, or to see what somebody else could get out of him. They weren't there to learn or to grow in their faith. They were curiosity seekers, manipulators, and con artists. And in one incident after another, Jesus was confronted by those who were demanding, threatening, or were completely unsatisfied. It may have been just a day or two before the incident that we haven't recorded in today's gospel lesson that Jesus actually went to the home of Mary and Martha. Many of us grew up hearing that story, didn't we? Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus, they were friends of Jesus. And Jesus often went there when he needed to rest and to recuperate. And this particular day, obviously, he went because he was invited to a good meal. His disciples were there, and Martha was busy in the kitchen. And pretty soon she comes out in the midst of it all, and she begins to rant and to rave against her sister Mary. Tell her to get up. Make her come help me. She went on and on and on. Somehow Mary was unfair to her. No one appreciated her. And Jesus listened to it all. And then finally, when Martha had to take a breath, he said, Martha, you're worried and distracted by so many things. But only one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better part, and it won't be taken from her. Only one thing is necessary. Christians, that was the exact message that Jesus was trying to get across to the man who came to him in today's story. Don't let this tear your family apart. Don't become so fixated on your inheritance that you let go of everything else. Only one thing, just one thing is really important. The man was concerned, maybe rightfully so. But Jesus saw something else. And so he told the parable. The parable of the rich fool. Because you see, he really was a fool. He becomes concerned with storing his excess goods. He was more concerned with that than striving for God's reign. Here was a man who had plenty for himself. It wasn't the riches that was wrong. It was the fact that it was his. And he was going to hold on to it. Never once does he stop to think that maybe he could let go of a little bit of what he had so that someone else could have something too. Never once did it cross his mind that if he kept building bigger barns and storing all of that grain, well, you know what happens to grain when you store too long? It rots. The rats get to it. All of those things escaped him because all he could focus on was the fact that he wanted the wealth that went along with the grain. That's all he was concerned about. And so his only plan was to build bigger barns so he could accumulate more wealth. Well, reflecting upon this parable, Dr. Audrey West, who is the adjunct professor at the Lutheran School of Theology, she wrote, with all the excess at the center of his life, the man plunges into a trap of idolatry, an idolatry that is often idolized by our culture. The nearly constant message of today's media is that life does indeed consist of the abundance of our possessions. We are encouraged to spend more, have more, and use more, to supersize and maximize, to bank on the appearance of wealth as a sign of a good life. Insofar as the culture cultivates a propensity to buy things we do not need, it champions a way of life that this parable characterizes as folly. Close quote. Now, Dr. West really doesn't say anything that we haven't heard before. And actually, she doesn't say anything that most of us don't already know. As 21st century Americans, we live in a culture of extreme excess. But what are we supposed to do? Our children see the ads. They have a right to fit in. If we want to get ahead professionally, well, there are certain expectations that we have to live up to. We can't just go to any college, and we can't live in any house or drive any car. We have to dress for the role. And if we don't, we'll be left behind. So until someone comes up with a better plan, we have no other choice but to build bigger barns. We have plenty of big barns, but we are now known as the most unhappy and angry nation on earth. So Christians, today's your lucky day. I have good news for you. God has a better plan. Now, before you start rolling your eyes and insisting you've been down that road before, please hear me out. God's plan does not include our abandoning careers and going to live on the streets of New York City. But neither does it include losing our lives while pursuing the bigger, the better, and the more promising things that society has to offer. What the man in today's parable lacked, and what most of us lack too, is balance. In his desire to accumulate more wealth, he forgot to live. And in our desire to accumulate possessions, experiences, titles, promotions, popularity, gold medals, or whatever glittery thing that happens to catch our eye, you know, the latest and greatest must-have things, well, then we too, we've forgotten how to live balanced, healthy, and productive lives. So over the next 6 weeks, we're going to examine God's plans for our lives. We're going to be invited to look at our priorities and to see if or how our faith informs the decisions that we have been making. And after we examine the various facts of our lives, we will be invited to choose those areas that seem to be out of control, the ones that demand the most of our time and our talents and our money. And we're going to invite God to become first in our decision-making process. The man in today's parable, well, the title fit. He was a fool in so many ways and on so many levels. And maybe we are too. But it doesn't have to be that way. Yeah. With God's help, we can change. To God be the glory. And all God's children say,